Back in 1964, my wife and I went to the Olympic Games in Tokyo. And before the swimming events started each day, this Japanese gentleman walked up and down the deck of the pool ringing a bell just about this size. And that was to indicate the meet was about to start. I thought, well, that's a clever idea. I like it. So I came back to Iowa City, and I've been ringing the bell for 29 years before every Iowa swimming meet. And people would say to me when I'd go to make a talk, why didn't you bring your bell to indicate you're about ready to start? So now I bring the bell, and I brought it today to ring and to let you know that I'm ready to start our bus tour. And I would like to introduce the man who's been going with me, helping me of late, Richard Martin, who is quite knowledgeable about Iowa City history, has studied a great deal on it. Mr. Martin's father was Senator Martin, Iowa Senator Martin, in Washington. He was also in the House of Representatives. So Mr. Martin, who is with us today, has a good Iowa background, and I've been having him go along, and when I can't conduct the tours anymore, he's going to continue with them. One thing you might be wondering about, where did we get this land? These are Indian lands where we are today in Iowa City, and the U.S. government bought these lands from the Indians. For the eastern part of Iowa, there were 3 purchases. The first one was the Black Hawk purchase. Indian Chief Black Hawk was named after him. They bought that in 1832, and that was 50 miles to the west of the Mississippi River from the border of border of Missouri and Iowa, all the way north to the upper Iowa River up towards the Minnesota border. So they bought that from Chief Black Hawk, and they paid him $20,000 a year for 30 years. Not him, but I mean the Indians. $20,000 a year for 30 years, and the money was paid in specie. Now, specie, if you don't happen to know, is coin money. It's not like a bill that could be worthless. It was paid in gold, so that it always was worth the $20,000 a year that they paid him. Then the next purchase was the Keokuk purchase, which is 400 square miles along the Iowa River. Chief Keokuk was a very smart Indian. He had blue eyes, incidentally, because his mother, Lolita, was part French. And then the third purchase was 1,250,000 acres. So there were 3 purchases of land along here where we live today. That's how the federal government got that land. Well, we're going to start in just a minute, but I do want to tell you that back in June 1918, where we're sitting in this bus today, the Iowa River was on a rampage. It was really flooding, and it was flowing right down this street, Madison Street, about 2.5 feet deep. So it's good we weren't there in June 1918, because we probably would have got stalled. Well, now we're ready. We're going to go up the hill, and I'll give you bits of old-time history as we talk about some of the buildings that we're going to pass. Okay, would you start, please? Now we're going up Jefferson Street Hill. Jefferson was named after President Jefferson. I'll tell you more about the names of these streets and where they came from. They did a good job in naming Iowa City streets. They named them after important people. So often streets in a town are just given any kind of a name. Sometimes it's the name of one of the children or their wives' names. But when they named Iowa City, they named it after important people. Now, if you'll stop when we get up here. Okay. Yes, whatever you get off. All right. Now this building that you see across on the left, the big red building, yeah, can you stop here now? Yeah. The big red building is Calvin Hall. And that's one of the great engineering feats of the university. When they moved that building, where it is now, They moved it from over here where McBride Hall is today. And it took them all summer to move it. This building weighed 6,000 tons. This was back in 1905, and they wanted to get this campus park cleared so they could build special buildings for the university. And this building was in the way where McBride was to go. They were going to tear it down, and Professor McBride and Professor Calvin said, "Oh, that building it was only built in 1883. This is 1905. It's a good building. We can't afford to tear it down." So they said, "We'll get someone in Chicago to come out and move it." So they got one of those big movers in Chicago to come out. They took all summer. They got it up. They jacked the building up, and there were 30 jacks under it with rollers, and there was a big Irishman with a strong voice, and he'd say, "Yo," and everybody would turn their jack a half a turn, and then the building would maybe move a half an inch, and they did that all day long. He'd yell, "Yo," and they'd twist their jack. The building would move a half an inch. Every night the people in Iowa City came down to see whether the building had moved 2 feet or 3 feet. And they did that all summer. Finally, they got the building turned around and on a foundation over here, and it's been here on that corner ever since 1905. They wanted to move the building because they were trying to get the campus. The 8th president of the university, George McLean, wanted the campus after they moved the capital to Des Moines in 1857. He wanted the campus to be the one, have Old Capitol in the center, and 5 fine limestone buildings on each, 4 on each corner. This one is McBride. That was built in 1906. The one to the south of it, Schaefer, was built in 1898. Then the McLean building, which was first called the Physics Building, which is on the southwest corner, was built in 1912, and this one was the last one over here, Jessup Hall. So that's why they moved this building away, because they needed the space for these other buildings. And these movers did such a good job, they didn't upset a single test tube. There was not a crack in the building. So it was one of the great engineering feats of the university history. So when you go by it, Calvin Hall, take a look at it and remember what a great job they did. Okay, the building over on this corner is the limestone building is called Gilmore Hall. It was originally the Law College, but way back, Chauncey Swan's Hotel was on that corner. That block over here, which is now, they're putting up a great new University Business Administration building. That block was the business block to begin with. The post office was in that block. The first store was in that block. The implement business was in that block. So that was the first part of the Iowa City Business District up here. Well, it didn't work out as the business district. They later moved a bit to the south. Well, anyhow, that's where Chauncey Swan's Hotel was, a 3-story frame hotel, and he said, "We got the best view in Iowa City." And they did have a beautiful view of the Iowa River down here. And then in June 20th, 1841, the men were working on Old Capitol over here. They were up to the 2nd floor by then, and one of them yelled out, "Steamboats a-comin'." And then they all started yelling, "Steamboats a-comin'." And sure enough, a steamboat, the Ripple, was coming up the Iowa River from the Mississippi. That's the first steamboat to get to Iowa City. And everybody was excited, and they all went down to the Iowa, which is now the Iowa Avenue Bridge, where the steamboat docked, and they welcomed the passengers. Captain Jones, and he had 6 passengers and a lot of cargo. And Iowa City was so excited about that steamboat getting here that they had a banquet in Chauncey Swan's Hotel, which was this one over on the corner here. And they had a big occasion, they thought that they were going to have regular service from the Mississippi River up to Iowa City, which would have been great because there was no other public transportation. But you could get up from the Mississippi River, and that went all the way to Minneapolis or all the way down to New Orleans, Keokuk, Fort Madison. There were all kinds of places they could bring shipments up on the river if the steamboat could get to Iowa City. Well, you know, I could have told them that that would never work out, because in September 1920, a friend and I paddled a canoe down the Iowa and the Cedar to the Mississippi at New Boston, Illinois, and then down the Mississippi to Keokuk. And you know, that first day that we were out of Iowa City in September, we had to get out and pull the canoe off of sandbars every half hour or so. So you see, the river most of the time was too shallow for a steamboat. But in April or in June or May, sometimes the river would be high enough so that they could. The second steamboat that got to Iowa City came April 21st, 1842, just a year after. And this was Captain Thayer, and he got here with a 120-foot long steamboat from the Mississippi, and he wanted to establish trade between Iowa City and the Mississippi, and so he invited the leading citizens to take an excursion on his steamboat. So they got on the steamboat at 1 o'clock down where the Iowa Avenue Bridge is, 125 people, and they went all the way up to the state quarry, where they got a lot of the stone to build Old Capitol. And it's rather interesting, as they were going up, they had to be dodging stone that was being floated down the Iowa River for use in Old Capitol. They would cut down trees, and then they would make a float and put these big pieces of stone on that, and they would float down the Iowa River, and they would get them out at the Iowa Avenue, or what is now the Iowa Avenue Bridge. Don't ask me how they got them from the river up to Old Capitol. I have no idea. I wonder myself. But of course, you know, they built the pyramids way back, so there was some way that they got them up there. But the stone in that state quarry was so good that the longer it was exposed to the air, the harder it got, and that's why they wanted to build much of Old Capitol with that stone. And later, when they built the Capitol in Des Moines, they opened up that quarry again and brought some of the stone from that quarry all the way to Des Moines because it was so good. That quarry is about a mile northeast of the town of North Liberty, and it's still available to take a look at. Okay, we'll move on now, and I'll tell you something about the campus in a minute. The building, the large building on the left is the new College of Business Administration building, $35 million. It's a wonderful building. I was afraid they'd make it of brick, but they made it. They're making it of limestone so that it matches the buildings on the campus. All right, on the far corner is the Congregational Church. You can't see the steeple, but it has a great big high steeple, and this church is one of the early churches to be built in Iowa City in 1868. It's a fine church. I think, Mr. Martin, isn't that the church you go to?
Yeah, when I was a kid we went there, and I've been there several times.
Yeah. Well, anyhow, it's a fine church, and it was not a large congregation, but it's connected with the Welsh Church southwest of Iowa City. And incidentally, President Sandy Boyd told me that that's the only piece of property in this whole square block that the university doesn't own. Everything else the university owns everything else, and this is the only piece of property owned otherwise. So that's sort of an interesting thing. Okay, well, and on the far corner over here with across the street from the Congregational Church is Newman Center, the Catholic Student Center, and on that corner originally were St. Mary's Elementary School and their high school. They closed those down, tore the buildings down when Regina was built, and the children from St. Mary's Church go out to Regina, as also the children from St. St. Patrick's Church, which we'll go by later. Okay, we'll turn the corner now.
Okay.
When they laid Iowa City out, platted it in 1839, they used 4 square blocks for the Capitol building. So there was a lot of land around here that wasn't used. And they had the first fairs, the first Johnson County fairs, like the 4-H fair in this corner right here. And they also had circuses in there once in a while. And I remember one time they tell about, I wasn't there, but they tell, it was before my time, but they tell about one of the circuses that had an elephant, a great big elephant named Betsy. And they let the children ride on the elephant. And think what a thrill that would be to ride an elephant. Well, that night that Betsy went on to Cedar Rapids, they just went across country on the roads. Her keeper got sleepy, and so he thought, well, they'll stop for a minute and take a nap. Betsy got loose, and she wandered all around up in the north end. She tore up all the gardens, ate all the cabbages, and when he woke up, he couldn't find his elephant, and pretty soon people came, and they were all excited. There was an elephant loose. Well, he got a hold of Betsy, and then there was no more trouble. But Betsy kind of livened things up in Iowa City that time, particularly the kids that got to ride on her. Okay, we'll move on now. We're going to stop at the next corner, and we're going to turn the calendar back 153 years to 1839, when Iowa City was platted. You see, after the government bought the land from the Indians, then they gave the territory of Iowa. See, Iowa wasn't a state yet. They gave the territory of Iowa 1 square mile, which they could sell lots on to get money to build the new Capitol building. So they had a big sale of lots. All Iowa City was at the time were 2,000 stakes pounded in the ground. They marked the streets, and they marked where the lots were, and a man in a wagon went up and down the streets, and the crowd followed him, and they would auction off the different lots. Some of them sold for quite a bit, some for less. The one that sold for the most money is this lot right over here where Phillips Hall is today. That lot sold for $750, and all Iowa City was a bunch of stakes at the time. But they had great hopes that Iowa City might be another Chicago, and so that's why someone paid $750 for that lot. Where the Presbyterian Church is, 2 blocks north, that lot sold for $300 because that was an important lot. All the lots close to the Capitol, the new Capitol grounds, sold high. And it's rather interesting, my briefcase, rather interesting, they had a lot of trouble in those first years. People let their hogs run loose, and there are a lot of them down on the Iowa River, and so they just ran loose uptown, and the restaurants, they got to the restaurants garbage cans, and they just picked up scraps everywhere, tore up gardens, and so they passed a law in 1855, put up your hogs. And people had to put up their hogs, and they couldn't let them run loose. If they ran loose, well, they grabbed the hogs and they put them, and then the owner had to come and pay to get the hog out. And they had a way of keeping track of their hogs. One man would have a mark where he would punch a round hole in the elephant's ear, and another one would use a square hole, and somebody else would use a triangle. And so that's the way they kept track of whose hogs, which ones owned which hogs. So this caused a lot of trouble, and the political parties took up the challenge. They were quite concerned because the Democrats owned the hogs down by the river, and the Republicans didn't like it, so they took up party lines. The Republicans got the law finally passed, and so they couldn't let the hogs run loose anymore. Well, anyhow, it's just kind of an amusing bit. And the campus had to have a real tight fence. Yeah. the campus had to have a real tight fence so that the hogs couldn't get in there. And the man, the caretaker, they gave him a dog so that if a hog did get in there, he'd have some way of chasing the hog out. And all of the houses had to have tight fences to keep the hogs out. But finally, when they got the law passed, well, they didn't have any more trouble. Well, anyhow, they did a good job when they platted Iowa City. Iowa Avenue was made the widest street. It's 120. It was 120 feet wide, and it was to be the main street. And it was patterned after Washington D.C., where the Capitol is at one end of Pennsylvania Avenue, and the White House is at the other. In this case, Old Capitol was to be at this west end of Iowa Avenue, and the governor's mansion was to be in Woodlawn, which is 11 blocks to the east. Well, of course, the governor's mansion was never built because the Capitol was moved to Des Moines in 1857. But Woodlawn became a very beautiful private residential enclave section. Sometime walk through there and take a look at the fine old homes up there and the beautiful trees. They're just like they were originally. So that's Iowa Avenue, which was the finest street. There were 5 streets that were 100 feet wide: Jefferson, Washington, Clinton, which we're on now, and Capitol and Madison. Madison, Jefferson, Washington were all named after presidents. Clinton, where we are now, was named after the governor of New York City, DeWitt Clinton. And then, of course, Dubuque Street, which we'll come to next, was named after the city of Dubuque. I can't remember what Lynn was named after, but when we get to Gilbert, I'm going to tell you about where Gilbert Street got its name. That's a very interesting story, but I'll wait till we get there first. Now we're going to turn the corner here, and the building on the Dye building, right across here, was built in 1915 to 18. There had been a 4-story St. James Hotel on this corner. It burned Easter week in 1915. A lot of students lived there. It was sort of a student dormitory, and they lost everything, all their books, all their possessions, because they were all home for a vacation. Well, now we're on Iowa Avenue and going up to the next corner. My grandfather got here in 1857, and take a look. They later had a blacksmith shop where this Chinese restaurant is, but my grandfather had 2 trades. He was a wheelwright and a blacksmith. And we'll stop right here now. A wheelwright and a blacksmith, and they were 2 trades very much in demand on the frontier. A wheelwright builds wagons, and of course a blacksmith shoes horses. He got a job with the Stagecoach Company, and he worked there as long as the stagecoaches were operating. And then he set up his own blacksmith shop, which was right here. My father and my uncle had followed him with the shop until 1920. So it was there for many, many years. They took great pride in the fact that they ran a blacksmith shop where profanity was not used. I don't know just why that was such a feature, but they seem to think it was anyhow. Well, now on this corner where Pizza Hut is, the first church service was held the summer of 1839, the year that they platted Iowa City. Matthew Tonight had a 2-story log cabin right here where Pizza Hut is, and they had this first service here. A circuit rider came through on horseback with his Bible and his saddlebag and his hymnal, and he conducted the first service. It was a Methodist service here. My maternal grandparents were here at that time. They weren't even married yet, but they were here, my maternal great-grandparents. So I'm a long-time resident of Iowa City. They were here when the town was laid out, and of course I was born in Iowa City. It'll be 92 years ago in December. So we've always lived in Iowa City. You know, the truth is we never had enough money to get out of town. Okay, my grandparents later were married by the minister that conducted that first service here. If you stop when you get around the corner to the left. Now look at this building here where it says the barn collections. Can you see this over here? And then you're going to stop when you get around. That corner was part of what they called a church preserve. A church could get a quarter of a block free of charge if they'd agree to build a church costing $1,000 within 3 years. And so the Unitarian Church was built on this corner over here. And it was really a pretty fine church, but in those early years, they had no money to build churches, and so they had to go back east to get money. And the Unitarian Church went back to New York City, and they did pretty well because P.T. Barnum, did you ever hear of Barnum and Bailey Circus?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, P.T. Barnum gave them quite a bit of money to build this church, and also Horace Greeley, Go West Young Men. So they provided a lot of the money to build that church, which was really a pretty nice church. And I just wonder, Barnum, of course, would never know, but years later, his circus would come up, would parade up this street to Market and back on Clinton, and there would be 52 elephants who would parade, who would shuffle up this street past that church that he had, where the church had been originally. The church was gone by then, but those elephants would shuffle up the street past that place. Also the giraffes, the lions and the tigers in their cages, the giraffes, hippopotamus. The circus was a great institution. I tell you, when it came to town, it was a wonderful day. We loved it. Mr. Martin will remember those early days too, because we did have so much fun. We'd go down at 5 o'clock to see the circus get to town. It'd be on special trains, 5 of them. They come in at 5 in the morning. We'd watch them unload and put up the cook tent, and they'd run a flag up, and that was the first to get up because they all wanted breakfast, and the word would go out, the flag's up. That meant they could go up and get breakfast. So the circus was a great institution, and I just mentioned it because P.T. Barnum did have a part in the development of that church here. Now this corner that we just went around, there was a horse watering trough right in the center, a hexagonal trough, right in the middle of the intersection, and that hexagonal watering trough was a great institution. It had 6 sides, and the horses could come up from 6 sides, and they had 6 drinking fountains for people too, and people used it. But the thing that was most exciting and most unusual about the place was the fact that in those days they used to have hazing between the university freshmen and sophomores, and the sophomores would catch some unsuspecting freshman, and they'd all drag him over to this fountain, and they would dunk him in that fountain. And of course everybody would laugh and clap and cheer. So the fountain did cause lots of fun in that fashion. But it got to be, it was the horses were sticking out too far one way or another, and the fire truck didn't think they could get past, and then the streetcar wanted to come up here in 1910, and so they finally had to take that drinking fountain out, and they put it in one of the lagoons out at the city park. Well, I'll tell you one more bit about this corner, and it's rather interesting. Over on that far side was the wood market. A man would come up with his team and wagon, and it would be loaded with wood. And so he would stand there until somebody came along and said, "Oh, I want a load of wood." So then he'd deliver it to the man's house. And there'd be 6 loads of wood up here. That was the only way people had to heat their houses in those early years. There was no chance for coal at that time because there was no way to get it here. There was coal, of course, down in Illinois and in southern Iowa, but there was no railroad at that time to get it here. So everybody burned wood. I remember we burned wood at our house. And you did pretty well with wood. It wasn't quite like the furnaces today. We're all spoiled today. We just push a button and we got heat. And then in the summer we push the button the other way and we got heat. We got refrigeration. So we're kind of spoiled. But in those early days they had to do a lot of different things. Okay, we'll move on. This corner here, years ago, Iowa City was always afraid they were going to move the university to Des Moines. Everybody said, well, Iowa City is not the center of the state. It should be in Des Moines. So they were quite concerned. I remember even as a boy, years later, I used to worry every time the legislature got together that they might move the capital or the university to Des Moines. They never did, and it was never really much of a chance because they had so many big buildings here already. But to sort of calm the state down, the people of Iowa City gave this park, which is right here on our right, the city park, they gave that to the university, and they built a great big building right on this corner, and that sort of quieted things down so they didn't talk so much about moving to Des Moines. All right, we'll move up to the next corner. The building on the left, on this first corner on the left, was the College of Medicine in 1905. The one that they had built in 1881 up south of Old Capitol, that one burned in 1901, and so they had to build a new one, and this was built at that time. This building this big 4-story building over here on the far corner, it's now Berkeley Apartments. But back in 1850, a man named Ferdinand Haberstraw built a hotel there, and there was this building. And it was very prosperous for a long time because the legislature was in Iowa City. And a lot of the legislators stayed there. Then when they moved the capital to Des Moines in 1857, then the hotel didn't do so well anymore. And finally, they just went broke, and Mr. Haberstraw's widow then gave the building to the Catholic Church, St. Mary's Church, and they made a Catholic girls' dormitory. A Catholic girls' boarding school. And girls from all over the area came here to go to school. Some Iowa City girls went to the boarding school because they had a very fine music program. It was kept as a school from 1860 till 1911, and then it was made into Savendi Hall for the university as a dormitory, and later it became the apartments. The Methodist Church on the far corner, the white stone church, and the Catholic Church next to it are an interesting story. They were both part of the church preserve. There were 4 church preserves, and this was one of them. And the Methodists got, in December 1840, got half of the preserve for their church, and they've had 4 churches on this corner, and St. Mary's got theirs the same month, December 1840, and they had one church before the one that's there now. The one that's there now has the tallest steeple in the city, and I think it's 208 feet. I'm not quite sure about that height. There's some variation. Some people say that, some say 196, but anyhow it's close to 200 feet, and there are bells up in the top of that play chimes. Rather interesting, this Methodist church that's built here now was built after a fire April 23rd, 1906, and they built this stone church, which is the only stone church in this whole area. I never realized it, but someone pointed it out to me one time. And the stone church was here, got very, very black from all the smoke dust. Oh, it really was dark. It looked bad. And then in 1960, they sandblasted it for $10,000, and now it looks white like it should, like it did originally. I got pictures of it taken from the top of this building here, the physics building, Van Allen building. I got pictures from the 7th floor of the church before the sandblasting and after. And it was a very, very interesting series of pictures, and I ran them in the paper. St. Mary, okay, we'll turn the corner now. St. Mary's Church have had that clock up there. They didn't put that in when the church was built in 1869, but it was put in very soon after that, and also the chimes. And we've all been using that clock for years and years. And it's pretty handy to look up there and get the time when you're driving by. boys and girls, this building off to the right, well, it's a series of buildings, used to be the University Hospital. And it was a big institution. It was there from 1897 until 1928. I remember when they moved across the river to the new hospital. I tell you, that was quite a promotion to get all these sick people moved over to the new hospital, and they had kitchens on one side, kitchens on the other. Some people were on a diet that was prepared on this side, and they were on the other side. It was quite an exciting move, but they did a good job of it, and nothing serious happened, except some people went without their supper that night. The house, this is now Seashore Hall. It's a big building. There are lots of offices and important deals over there. Now if you move just and stop again. This house to the left that has the iron fence on it is now the Dr. Dull residence. Originally it had been the Englert residence, and it was over on Market Street originally. It's a real fine house. It has colored glass windows on the west side. The floors are wonderful. It was an expensively built house, and Dr. Dulles have done a good job restoring it. So this is one of the historic houses of Jefferson Street. Okay, we'll turn the corner now and stop. Now we're turning the corner onto Gilbert Street, famous Gilbert Street. You'll be interested in this story. The street is named after John Gilbert. John Gilbert was the Indian trader. He traded with the Indians. He was the first white man to trod the soil of Johnson County. He was the first white man. He came in 1826. No other white men were here then. He represented the American Fur Company, and he would trade merchandise, saddles, guns, things that the Indians wanted for their furs and hides. And he would trade with them all winter long, and then in the spring he would put these furs and hides on boats, on skiffs, on canoes, and float it down the Iowa River to the Mississippi. In the Mississippi they would be hooked onto steamboats and taken all the way to St. Louis, and down there they would sell them to the Laclede to a fur company down there, and then Gilbert's people would bring merchandise back up to Iowa City, and it was a real difficult job because they had to pole the boats up, they had to tow them up. I don't know how they ever did make it. Having canoed down it, I could just realize the problems that they encountered. But anyhow, they finally got up here with the merchandise, and Gilbert would run another year then. But Gilbert thought he should be a little closer to Powashik's Indian village, which is on the Sand Road, right at the end of where did I pull it?
No, you're okay.
Right where the Pleasant Valley have their nurseries. He built another trading post down there, and that trading post looks a great deal like the one out at the city park. There's a double log cabin out there, and that is somewhat similar to what John Gilbert's Indian trading post looked like. Well, John Gilbert died when he was only in the new log cabin, the double log cabin. He was only there about a year, and they had his funeral there, and Powashik and some of the Indians came because John Gilbert was greatly loved by both whites and the Indians, and so they buried him in the garden outside of there. In another year they thought, well, that's no place for such an important man to be buried, so they removed his casket and took it up to Oakland Cemetery. They buried him up there. They put a wooden slab to mark this is the grave of John Gilbert, the first white man to trod the soil of Johnson County. And then vagrants, vandals, went through the cemetery and they pulled out that wooden slab that marked the place where John Gilbert was buried. So today, the first white man to trod the soil of Johnson County, John Gilbert, lies in an unmarked grave in Oakland Cemetery, but Iowa City's longest street, Gilbert Street, is named after him. So remember when you go on Gilbert Street of John Gilbert and the great story of his life. Okay. Mr. Martin, am I forgetting anything? Or am I
doing the very, very wonderful
okay.
presentation.
Mr. Martin knows it just as well as I do.
Don't say that.
This is the oldest grocery store in Iowa City, John's Grocery. And then if you'll stop when you turn left.
Okay.
The first Catholic Mass was performed 1 block north of here in Mr. Haberstraw's house. He's the man that gave that building where the Park Hotel was. They held the first Mass in his house, and they used the mantle on the fireplace as the altar. Now we're turning on to Market Street, and it's interesting. There were three breweries within 1 block here. And today I don't think, maybe there's 1 brewery in the state of Iowa, but there were 3 in Iowa City. Of course, in those days, they were small breweries. The largest one was this one over here, which made what they called Erlanger beer. And that was said to be, their slogan was, the beer that made Milwaukee jealous. So there were these 3 breweries in this block and the next one. We'll move on now then. And Market Street, incidentally, was one of the first streets to be paved in Iowa City, 1910. In those original years, in the spring, the city was just a quagmire. The wagons going through the mud, and they had an awful time. Then in 1875, Mayor Rickard, who was the mayor of Iowa City, put rock in the downtown business district, and that helped a great deal. And then they paved the downtown business district. Would you stop at this? Oh, yeah. Just after we get up past this building. A little further. I'll interrupt my paving to tell you a bit. This building off to the left, they call it Brewery Square today. This is where Hutz and Geiger had their brewery way back in the 1850s. And Mr. Geiger lived in this brick house that you see right over here. Quite a beautiful house. And it's now owned by the Methodist Church for their part of their student center. And rather interesting, that house has a round window up at the top. That's called an oculus window. A lot of houses that were built back in the 80s and 90s had those round windows up at the top. Oculus is like an eye. You know, you look out there and you see what's going on below. So they built a lot of houses in the early years with those windows in it. And it's interesting, this house also, on the side, you see that sort of a bay window that sticks out? Well, they used to have stained glass, beautiful stained glass in that. And one Christmas vacation when the students were all gone, and there was no one in the house, vandals went through and actually stole the windows out of that house, those stained glass windows. That's a very old house, and it's in good shape. It's quite historic in Iowa City, particularly since it was. There's some say. Okay, now we'll move on up to the next. We're going to turn the corner up here, and the church on the far side is Gloria Dei, and that's always been a Lutheran church corner. Originally, the English Lutherans and the German Lutherans were both together there. And then they decided that since the Germans wanted to have some of their services in German, that it would be better if they separated the 2 churches. So the English Lutheran Church has been on this corner, And this is the third church they've had there. And then the German Lutheran Church, which I'll show you a bit later, it was built about the same time, and those German Lutherans built the church themselves. They went out and cut down the trees, and they made the brick, and they built the church themselves because they, like the churches in the early days, they had no money. Well, now we're going to come to a house up here that's very, very unusual. Would you move up to the corner? On the next corner, on the far side, I want you to take a real good look at this house, built in 1875, and you'll notice it has a turret on the top. It's round, it's 3 floors high. But that turret, incidentally, boys and girls, they built a lot of houses with those turrets on them. They gave them a certain, they had more character to them, and it didn't cost so much then because labor was cheap and the materials were cheap, and so a lot of houses had those turrets built on them. The rounded part, even the glass was rounded. Now they can't get rounded glass, so they have to, if one gets broken, they have to replace it with regular glass. But it used to be rounded glass. So this, there was a madam, I can't think of her name. Do you remember her name? Oh,
I got it here.
There was a woman who had patent medicine. Madam Mosley, wasn't that
Mosley,
it?
yeah.
Madam Mosley lived there at one time, and she sold patent medicines and actually made them in that house. I don't know just what significance that has, but it's sort of interesting. Later, J.M. Fisk, who was head of the university grounds and buildings, lived there for many years. But that is an unusual house, so sometime when you're driving past, take a look at it, or have your folks drive past, and you can see what a nice, unusual house it is. Go ahead. On the next corner, there's another turret house. Actually, this next house, which is owned by Mr. Houghton, Jim Houghton, is called the turret house, and it has a turret on the top. I want you to take a look at it, because those were sort of a standard procedure for better homes. Can you stop on the corner here? And if you look out, you can see on the top there is a turret on the house. Okay, we'll just go on now. In the middle of the next block, boys and girls, I hope you don't mind my sitting down sometimes. Old men sometimes get tired. So the middle of this next block, will you stop in front of the brick house here?
Okay.
This little brick house was built in 1858 by Sylvanus Johnson. He was by Sylvanus Johnson. He built a real fine house out on Prairie du Chien, a beautiful house out there. But the next year, he built that one in 1857 out there. It's still standing, a very, very lovely place. And then in 58, he built this house, and it's been resold. A man by the name of Moen, an attorney, bought it, and the house is restored to what it used to look like. So just remember, this house is one of the older houses in Iowa City, 1858. Okay, we'll move on a block and a half to Church Street, and we're going to turn left on Church Street. And it's rather interesting, boys and girls. They named, when they laid out Iowa City, Church Street was named because they thought they'd have a lot of churches on it. And they had 2 church reserves on it, but there never has been a church on Church Street. So you can always remember that as one thing unusual about Church Street. Now we're going to turn left on Church Street, and we'll go to the University President's house. That was built in 1908. A man named B.A. Wickham, 5,000. He built it for 25,000. He was an uncle he married my father's sister, so I knew the family well. But you can't imagine that house being built for $25,000. They have remodeled it twice in the last few years. Once it cost $250,000 to remodel it, and the other time it cost $300,000 with some of the remodeling that they did. But this house is built because it has such a beautiful view of the You can see the white pillars on the front of it. It's on the right, boys and girls. It really is a lovely place. It's rather interesting. The property had originally been given to the university for an observatory, and so they built an observatory on this location. And the understanding was that if the property was ever used for anything besides an observatory, it was to be returned to the owners. Well, they wanted to move the observatory to a more central point, so they did, but they never got around to giving it back, and the people that had given it didn't particularly want it back, and so the university kept it, and after about 25 years they decided they'd like to use it for the president's house. So they had to get permission from all of the heirs of these people, and I happened to see them down in the university archives. There must have been a couple of hundred permits saying, yes, you may build this, the president's house on this property that our forebears gave. So they finally got it all worked out, and the house was built here. Okay, we'll turn the corner. Now this first house we're going to see on the right, on your right, is really an outstanding house. It has a long, rich history. It's a Peter A. Dye house. I know you remember where the Dye building was. I guess I forgot to mention it. Just a little further so they can see the sign. Okay, this is good right here. So this is the Dye house. It was built by Peter A. Dye, who was a railroad engineer. He helped build the railroad from Detroit to Chicago, and then he was a vital factor in building the railroad from Chicago to Rock Island, and then from Rock Island to Iowa City. And when he got here, he thought Iowa City was such an unusual city that he liked to make this his home. While his work took him out from here a lot, he thought this is where he wanted to live. He was in love with a girl back in New York State, and he wanted her to marry him, but she was afraid to marry him. She said, out in Iowa there are nothing but ruffians and Indians. I'm afraid to go out there. Well, he said, that's not true, not true. I will build you a beautiful home on the crest of the Iowa River with a boathouse down below and a lot of nice things. And so he drew her the plans for the house, and so they were married, and they moved in here in 1857, and they lived the rest of their lives there. And then their sons, Marvin and Curtis, lived in this house. They both married. Both families lived in the house. There's a kind of a neighborhood yarn. They said that one year Curtis and his wife would live in the front half of the house, and Marvin and his wife would live in the back half. The next year, 5 years later, they'd reverse it, and Curtis would move to the back and Marvin to the front. That's the neighborhood story. I don't imagine it's really true, but it's a good yarn anyhow. But the house is beautiful, and they also built the Dye building. Peter A. Dye was president of the bank. He was president of the Historical Society. Just yesterday I had a letter from a great-great-grandson of Peter Dye wanting to know what I could tell him about this house. Well, I could tell him plenty, so I wrote him a long letter and told him everything I knew. And there's been a book at the Historical Society written on Peter Dye in the biographical series. So he was a great Iowa Citizen, a great Iowan. In fact, he was a great railroad man, a man of character. He was mayor of Iowa City. He was just about everything in Iowa City. So remember, this is one of the fine houses of Iowa City. Oh, I must tell you one other thing. When the students were on a rampage back in the 60s, you probably don't remember about that, but they got pretty wild, and they were throwing rocks at everything, and they came up here and they threw rocks at this house, and they broke one of the glasses in the transom. That house, that glass was cranberry glass. It's made with gold leaf somehow or other, very expensive. And so the university was concerned that they would break the other glasses in the transom, so they took them out. They took out all this cranberry glass and put in ordinary glass, and then they stored the cranberry glass where it would be safe. And you know what? Now they can't remember where they put the cranberry glass. Okay, we'll turn the corner here. This is the Baptist church on our left. That's the Second Baptist Church. The first one, the third one I should say, the first one was on Market Street, and after church they believed in immersion then, complete, when they baptized, complete immersion. And so after church they would walk down to the river and they would have the immersions of those that they wanted to baptize that day. That I picked up, that's a true story. I picked that up out of the history books. Rather interesting. Now we're going to go past the Alpha Psi Delta sorority, and then we're going to stop at a very unusual house. It was built in 1877. Has more Gothic lines in it than any other house in Iowa City. This is one of the fine old houses in Iowa City. One of the first houses with a furnace, one of the first houses with a bathroom. They had a system to pump water up to the top of the house for pressure. It was built by a man named Custer. Then his daughter married a man named Swishers. The Swishers lived here for years, and now it's Dwayne and Betty Means. Their families have owned it the rest of the time. So it is one of the fine houses in Iowa City. It has more Gothic features to it than any other house in Iowa City, according to Dr. Margaret Keyes, who is an authority on architecture. Now we'll move on. We'll retrace Dubuque Street for one block, and as I said, the streetcar came up here. There were 5 streetcar lines in Iowa City, and they were put in 1909 and 1910. Before that, people had no public transportation, so it was pretty important when they got streetcars. Now we're going to turn the corner, and we'll go on to Davenport Street. Davenport was named after the town of Davenport. The second house that you see here is another house with a turret on the top. Quite an interesting place. It's very, very old. The man that lived here was in the clothing business. I just forget his name. Do you remember his name? He was in the clothing business where Ewers is today. He was a Jewish gentleman, a very prominent. He was in the legislature. He was mayor of the town. He was very, very important in Iowa City. I remember, you know, one Halloween I went to a Halloween party at this house, and we bobbed for apples. Did you ever bob for apples? Boy, that's great stuff. Well, anyhow, I went to this party up here and bobbed for apples, and I found that if you bit into the apple and went clear to the bottom of it and got a good bite, then you could hang on to it. So if you're ever bobbing for apples, go clear to the bottom. I don't know why I tell you such crazy things in a history lesson. Okay, we'll turn to the corner. Now on the far corner is Courier Hall. That's the first dormitory that was built in Iowa City. That was built in 1912. It's a brick house, or excuse me, it's the brick dormitory on the far corner. Iowa City had 1912 was a building year in Iowa City, and this was one of the buildings that was built then.
Moses Bloom was the name of that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Moses Bloom. Thank you, Dick. Dick remembers the things I can't remember. Moses Bloom. He was very, very prominent. He had another very fine house. You know, they used to have the dormitories. All the dormitories for girls were on this side of the river, and the dormitories for the men were on the other side. Now the men and the women live in the same dormitory. Times change. This is another dormitory, Burge Hall. Burge is my middle name, and Mrs. Burge, whom this is named after, her husband was about a 32nd cousin of mine. Now this house is the Shambaugh house. It really was a fine place, built in 1902 by Professor Shambaugh. Mrs. Shambaugh was a very prominent photographer and writer in Iowa City, so they built this house, and whenever there would be any dignitary to the university, a lecturer or somebody very important, they would entertain them at a dinner at this house. And Professor and Mrs. Shambaugh were very, very good at entertaining these people, and they did a great job of it. The house is now the Honors House, but the Shambaughs lived there for years and years. Now this is kind of amusing, this next bit about the Presbyterian Church. Okay, can you move up just a little? It's called Old Brick now, and the Presbyterian Church is not in there anymore, but it was called Old Brick. When they started building this church, like all the churches, they had no money, so they sent their minister, Reverend Hummer, back east to get funds. So he was gone for over a year, and he came back with quite a bit of money, and so they were able to do quite a bit on finishing the church. And he also brought back a bell, which was very, very fine, and he was quite proud of the bell. Well, anyhow, he came back with some new ideas that the church on the frontier couldn't quite accept, and so they had a parting of the ways. It wasn't exactly a happy parting of the ways, and they gave him some of the Bibles and some of the lights and so forth. And then about 2 years after he was gone, he came back one day. He thought that bell and the belfry belonged to him, and so he decided he should come back and get it. So he came back with a man, and they put up a ladder there, and a block and tackle, and they went up the top of the church, and he lowered the bell, and then while the man, his friend, was going to get the wagon to load the bell, the people that belonged to the church found out what was happening, and they came along, and they took the ladder down, and Reverend Hummer was left up in the belfry with no way to get down, and he was pretty mad, and he was hurling boards and epithets, not becoming a minister, at these people down below. But in the meantime, they loaded the bell, and they went out, and he didn't know where they went, and so he didn't get the bell. But they buried the bell out in the Iowa River, right where Rapid Creek flows in. And they figured that after Reverend Hummer cooled off for a few months, they'd get the bell out of the river and bring it back and put it in the church again. Well, in the meantime, some men were going to the gold rush in 1850, and you see, there were a lot of men who went to the gold rush, thousands of them from all over the United States, and there were a lot from Iowa City, and there was a group from Iowa City heading out there, and they thought, well, we'll take that bell with us and we'll sell it to some church out there. So they loaded the bell, they got it out of the river, and they took it with them, and they sold it to the Mormons in Salt Lake City. So the bell is still in Salt Lake City, and Brigham Young at the time said Iowa City can have it, all they have to do is to pay the freight on it. Well, of course, Brigham Young's gone, and everybody's just about forgotten about the story except Mr. Martin and me, but we like to tell the story because Reverend Hummer did get pretty mad about it, but he didn't get the bell back. Well, anyhow, now we're going to move on a little more. Foster's Grocery was right along here in the post office, right on Clinton Street here. And the Carson Implement Company. Now in this next block, we went over this before, they had the first automobile show in Iowa City in 1915, right in the center of this street. They put up two great big tents, and they had all the different models on display. And of course, you wouldn't realize it, but the first automobiles, the biggest buyers were the farmers, because they were out in the country. They needed some fast way to get to Iowa City. People in Iowa City needed it, but by then they had streetcars, and so they could get around a bit. But the farmers were great buyers of automobiles that first year. And at that time, that was Easter week. As I told you, that St. James Hotel burned Easter week, and they were afraid that the sparks would set these tents afire where they were having the automobile show. Fortunately, nothing happened. Now we'd go right straight on down to Washington. But that was exciting when they had that first automobile show. You know, people didn't know much about automobiles. And the salesmen were not talking about the beauty of the cars. They were talking about the engines and how they worked and what made them run. And of course today, when you buy a car, you just assume it's going to run. But he was explaining how many carburetor and how many spark plugs and all those things each car had. And people were interested in those mechanical things at that time. That fence around Old Capitol originally was a great big high tight fence to keep the hogs out. Now you turn left here. Where the Old Capitol Center is now, that was a big business block. I think there were 5 livery stables, 3 or 4 hotels, some restaurants. It was a busy place. Of course, they were all small, but they were very, very important in the life of Iowa City. Livery stables were important because people would have a horse, they'd keep it at the livery stable, and the people at the livery stable would go out and pick them up in the morning and bring them downtown, and then in the evening they would drive them home and bring the horse and buggy back downtown, so that the individual didn't have to take care of him himself. Now the Iowa State Bank, which is on the right-hand corner here, the first bank in Iowa City was on this corner. Cook, Sargent, and Downey. Cook and Sargent were from Davenport, and Downey was the Iowa City representative. This little town of Downey out east of Iowa City was named after Mr. Downey, and he built a couple of very fine houses in Iowa City. So this is where the first bank was. It was built there in 1857. It was later closed. Nobody ever knew just quite why. It didn't go broke, but they discontinued. But this building, the Iowa State, was built in 1912. 1912 was a building year. You know, you can always tell what the prosperous years were by how many buildings were constructed. 1912 was a big one. This building was constructed. I told you Courier Hall was built in 1912. The Hotel Jefferson, which we will pass in a minute, was built in 1912. The Paul Helen Building, which we will pass, the English Theater, they were all built in 1912. So you can see those were busy building years. Just like on the west side, the field house was built in 27, the hospital in 28, the stadium in 29. Those were big building years. So it always seemed to work that way. The post office and the library were built in 1904. So those are interesting bits to kind of compare. And of course, the stadium was built in 29, and the stock market crashed the 5 days after the stadium was dedicated, so there wasn't any more building then for quite a while. And the depression, the Great Depression, was really terrible. We think this is a kind of a depression now, or times are not good, but this doesn't compare with what the Great Depression was like. Mr. Martin and I can remember, because we're just old enough to. But anyhow, those were important things that happened, these buildings. The Hotel Jefferson, there was a 3-story building. Can you move up just a little further? There was a 3-story building where this Jefferson building is now that the university owns. And there were a lot of stores on the first floor. Stewart's Shoe Store was in that first building, and it's still in this present building, Stewart's Shoe Store. The 3rd floor of that old building, can you stop? Was a hall. Mark Twain lectured there in 1869, and they later had a knitting mill up there, and they made dust cloths. And one time they had oil for the dust cloths, and in 1911 the oil barrels exploded and set the building afire, and it burned to the ground, and that's when the Hotel Jefferson was built. So, and then on down next, I guess we'll move on. The First National Bank was remodeled in 1911 on the far corner. And this Paul Helen building, which is on the right, that was a very fine office building, and still is. And so that was built in 1912. And the Englert Theater, I tell you, that was a great thing. That was sort of the Hansher of that era. Can you stop? It was sort of the Hansher of that era. They played the finest talent in the United States. Sarah Bernhardt, the great French actress, said to be the greatest actress of all time, played here in 1915. And she was 70 years old then, and she traveled with a special train, I mean 2 cars, her troupe and she. And the night that they played Iowa City, they left, and they went down, they got on these 2 cars, and the midnight train hooked onto those cars. They took it as far as West Liberty, and then at West Liberty, they stopped and unhooked those 2 cars. Sarah Bernhardt was lifted into a carriage, and she went north to Rochester, where she was said to have been born, and where her mother was said to have been buried. It's not true, but that's the legend, that's the myth. You better not tell anyone in Rochester you don't believe it, though. But anyhow, they think that she was born there and her mother was buried there. And that night she is said to have gone up to Rochester, put 2 dozen roses on her mother's grave, and came back and got on those 2 cars, and they hooked it on to the next train, and she went on to Chicago. Well, it's a great legend, though I don't believe it, but so I say don't tell anyone in Rochester you don't believe it, or you're going to have to get run out of town. Okay. Where the First National Bank parking lot was originally the first city hall, built in 1881. It was a big 2-story building, had a clock in the top, and the fire department was here, and the police department. It was a busy place. Then they tore it down and moved the city hall east a block, and the bank uses it now for a parking lot. The post office, or it's a senior center now, on the left-hand corner, was originally the post office. It was built in 1904 and then remodeled and changed all around in 1931. So it's an important building in Iowa City. The first post office you went into from Washington Street, and you had to climb a great big long flight of stairs. Well, it wouldn't have bothered me then, but I wouldn't care for it today. Now, as I told you, 1912 was a big business year. This hotel, this Now this is the Press Citizen building. That's much later. But the building next here was the Elks Club, and that was also built in 1920. I'm not sure which year that was built, I'm sorry. But the Chamber of Commerce has their headquarters in here. And of course the new Civic Center is off to the left. That used to be a lumber yard. You turn right here. Now the church on the right-hand side here is the Trinity Episcopal Church, built in 1871. It was not an expensive church. I think it only cost $62.50. But to me, it's one of the prettiest churches in Iowa City. It has the Gothic lines, and there's something on the top that they've had to take down because the wood was rotting. But really, probably the least expensive church in Iowa City is probably the most beautiful. That just happens to be my personal opinion. Across the street where the bus station is, used to be the Hutt's Pickle Factory. They used to make pickles in every town, you know, because they didn't have transportation. And across the street here, where the rec center is now, was a branch line of the Rock Island Railroad. They called it the Plug. It was built in 1872. And I'll tell you more about the Rock Island after a bit. Now Burlington Street is another one of those streets that was named after a city. Named after the city of Burlington. That was the temporary capital of Iowa, before Iowa City. I mean the territorial capital, not the state capital. Off to our left is St. Patrick's Catholic Church. It has a great big high steeple on it, and I was surprised how many crosses there were on it. So I counted one time, and there were 8 crosses on the St. Patrick's Church. That was built in 1877. It was originally primarily Irish people who went there. At first they had gone to St. Mary's. All the Catholic people had gone to St. Mary's to begin with. The Bohemians, the Irish, that is, who were Catholics. And the first 5 priests at St. Patrick's Church were all born in Ireland. So it really was a good Irish church to begin with. We'll come closer to the courthouse later, but you can see the dome, or the steeple, I don't know what you call it, on the top there. That was dedicated in June 1901. Iowa City had a great celebration when that was built. It cost $127,000, if you can imagine a building that size being built for such a low figure. Now you can get underneath that interurban bridge, can you? You're sure?
Yeah. If we can go around it.
Well, if you don't think you can get under it...
I've never run it with this particular bus.
You say you haven't?
I have not.
Well, then we better not try it. We'll just go straight across the river here. We're changing our route just a little because we don't know whether this bus will go under the interurban tracks on Iowa Avenue. Sometimes the bus will try to get under there and they can't quite make it. There was one bus that got caught there one time, and they didn't know what to do. They were just trying to figure some way to get out, and finally some boy came along and said, let some of the air out of the tires. They did, and they got the bus out. But we don't want to take a chance, so we're not going to cross the Iowa Avenue Bridge, and I'll try to tell you about that a little later. So we're going to cross the Burlington Street Bridge. This was the first free bridge in Iowa City. It was built in 1860. It was a 2-arch bridge, and it It was a great boon. It cost $10,000. When the river was high, there used to be a man called Bummy Kosderka. I think his name was Bohemel, but they always called him Bummy Kosderka. And he used to come down here at 4 o'clock, and the crowd would gather. This is when the river was at a very high stage, and he'd jump off of the bridge into the river and swim over the dam. And they'd take up a collection, and I don't know, he never got very much. He shouldn't have been doing it. Finally, he did it once when the river was too low, and he got caught in the undertow, and he never got away. He drowned. Many of the original pioneers with the covered wagons went across this bridge. Those that came before the bridge had to go across on a ferry, and the busiest ferry was up at Iowa Avenue. University of Iowa is one of the few campuses that's built on either side of a river. You know, when I started to the University of Iowa in 1918, there was not one single building on the west side of the river. So you can see what has developed in these years since 1918. Now the Iowa Avenue Bridge, originally there was a pontoon bridge there that they charged to get across, but it never was very satisfactory. Eventually it was taken down. Originally that busy ferry was here, and when these trainload or these covered wagons came through, maybe 50, 75, sometimes 100, it'd take a long time to get them all across this ferry. So they'd have to camp maybe a day or two on the east side of the river. The Centennial Bridge was built here, an iron arch bridge, in 1876. That was the centennial year. That's why it was called the Centennial. This bridge was built in 1960. And the present Burlington Bridge that we just crossed was built in 1950. Now we're going under the interurban tracks. I think you can get under these tracks. Most of our trip has been in the 1 square mile of the original Iowa City. We're going to go just a little outside of Iowa City for a little ways for several interesting bits. Now, can you slow down? I don't know if you can stop or not. When they were building the interurban in 1903 and 4, they had to cut a great big bluff here. Originally, all they did was to cut a slit through there, just wide enough for the interurban tracks. Well, while they were cutting that through in 1903 and 4, the winter, they had 200 horses kept in the tent down here, right to our east here, and they kept them there all winter while they were cutting that cutout. And then in 1904, they started interurban service every hour from Iowa City to Cedar Rapids and back. It was a very profitable deal from the very first. Now this is one of the Depression things that was built. They made a lot of made work back in the Depression, WPA and PWA. They had to provide work for these people that were unemployed, and the Depression, as I say, it was a great depression. It was terrible. People out of work, and so they did make these paid jobs, and they built all of this fine arts campus at that time. And that's where the money came from for that. This used to be a kind of a swamp, a dump of the river in here. And they filled it all in to where it is now. But originally, when that was a city dump, there were a lot of rats. Like always in a city dump, there were a lot of rats in there. Then when the water got high, why the rats had to leave, and so they had good choice of neighborhoods, so they chose Manville Heights, and that's where they went to while the water was high. Then they came back down here later. But this was all built in the 30s. Well, not Hampshire, but a good share of this was built in the 30s, and they were Depression jobs. Okay, we'll move on. Now we're coming up to the Iowa City Park. Now this park has really been a great one. The city bought it in 1906 from Walter Terrell. Walter Terrell had a dam across the Iowa River and a mill. And he also owned the land on this side, and so his family sold this to the city, 70 7/10 acres for $10,000 in 1906. And of course there's hardly any way to get to it. At that time this street was just a mud hole when it rained, and so they built a bridge across the Iowa River in 1908 so that people could get to the city park. Well, Walter Terrell got to be kind of miserly in his old age, and his daughter even graduated from the university in a law college in a calico dress. Well, 18 years after he died, this is a kind of an interesting story. 18 years after he died, his family found some notes saying that he had buried some gold pieces in the city park. And he said, go to the big oak tree at such and such a point, go 2 rods north, go a rod west, another 2 rods east, and dig down and you'll find the gold pieces. They followed directions, and sure enough, the gold pieces were in the city park. So when we get done with the tour today, if you're not busy, let's come up here and see if we can find some more gold pieces. One of the few smart things I have done in my day when we were building this new city park pool, they were going to have the bathhouse on the south side. And I said, well, if you put it on the south side, the sun will be to the south and everybody coming up for the baskets will be in the shade and it'll be cold. So we did turn it around, and now when you go to get your basket, you'll be in the sun and it'll be dry. So that was one of the few smart things that I suggested. Now we're going to go past that log cabin, which is a duplicate, or very close to a duplicate, of the one that John Gilbert built for his trading post down at the south end of the Pleasant Valley Nursery on the Sand Road. Now, if you look to the left, there's that double log cabin, and that's somewhat similar, though not quite as large, as what John Gilbert had. The space between the 2 log cabins was wider, and they also enclosed that. For some reason, they always called that part in between the log cabins the dog trot. So that's very similar to what that log cabin was that John Gilbert built down next to Poweshiek's Indian Village. This other is a small cabin that used to be in the fairgrounds out by City High, and they moved it down here back, I think, in 1914 or so. Okay. Now the first park bridge was built here in 1908, and there have been 2 more bridges. Well, this is the 3rd one that's built here. There used to be an iron arch bridge here, and we used to dive from the bridge. The water was deep enough that there's no danger. The Iowa River used to stay right close to the highway, and then back in 1945 or something, 6, they cut it through the city park because it was washing into the road. So they changed the course of the river, which I'm sorry. There used to be an island up here, a great place for picnics, and but it was undoubtedly a wise move because the river was just encroaching on the highway. Now originally, the river used to come right up to our highway here, and there was a dam across the river here to an island, and then another dam from the island to the city park. And they built a mill on this side of the river to grind grain. In those years, the only way they had for power was water power. There were no steam engines then, no electricity. So they had this dam here, and the water power revolved wheels, and these wheels turned stones that ground the grain. There are two of those stones over here in the park that we won't get to them today, but it's a good place for you to ride sometime and take a look at those stones. There's a story telling about it, and those stones are right where the mill used to be. And there was an island in the river here. It was a great picnic place. We used to swim there, canoe up to it, skate up to it. In those days, the river froze solid, and we could skate clear to Coral. So I used to skate on it, canoe on it, swim on it. So it was a great recreation place, but they don't seem to use it that way so much anymore. And Mr. Terrell, besides the dam that he had here, built a beautiful mansion right in back of where the Mayflower is today. And this mansion he built in 1851. It was there until 1960, and it became a supper club and then a nightclub later on. And it was just torn down when they built the Mayflower here. There's a house up in here. It was built in 1857 by Mr. Englert because he was cutting ice out of the Iowa River. The river came right down here to the street at that time. So he built his house there in 1857. It was a stagecoach stop, and then later when they ran a launch up and down the Iowa River, they used to stop here for refreshments in a little restaurant. And then later the Pownell family bought it in '28, and they've lived here ever since. And the house is very, very nice, nicely built, and they still use it as their home. Okay, now if you can go on up. Then we go on up to that house up. There's a house up here with the two garages down on the street level. The house is up 52 steps. I know it's 52 because I climbed them once. But it's the house was built by Dr. Jacobson in 1928. It's now the home of the Dr. Coulters. Very fine house. The garages are down on this street level here. Yeah, here are the garages that belong to this house. And now be careful when you turn around up here. And you can see the steps that go up to the house.
See, I've never seen this house before.
Okay, that's good. Well, boys and girls, you can hardly see it, but there are two of the millstones over here. And I hope sometime if you look through there, you can see them. They're about 3 and 4 feet in diameter. And those stones were close together, and the grain was between them, and so that would grind the grain into flour. And they used to come from 40 and 50 miles away to get their grain ground because there was no other place to get it ground. See, they had to use the water power, and this was the only water power around here available. So they did come in from 40, 50 miles. Sometimes they'd have to stay all night. Okay.
See it right through there?
This hill's been graded down, hasn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Boys and girls, this is called the Mill Hill. It used to be real steep, as Mr. Martin just said. It's been graded down. But when they came from the mill, after they got the grain ground or to get it ground, they had to go up this steep hill. Before it was paved, it was pretty tough to get up here. So they called it the Mill Hill, and it sloped to the north, so it was a long time drying out. Now we're going to turn when we get up here to Ronald Street. And Ronald Street was named after John Ronalds. John Ronalds was one of the three men who selected the site for Iowa City May 4th, 1839. Yeah, this is the street to turn right here. And then you turn at the next corner again. No, left. Left. You go just one block.
Okay.
Now this is Lynn Street we're going to turn on now. It was one of the first streets that was paved outside of the downtown business district. It was paved from downtown out here to Brown Street. And the reason they were so anxious to get Lynn and Brown paved was because in the spring when the cemetery, when they were taking funerals up to the cemetery and it was muddy, they just had a terrible time getting up there. So they paved Lynn Street, this is Lynn, in 1903 and Brown in 1907. So these two streets were brick too. These are made with Purrington brick, if you can stop just a minute. Made with Purrington brick. They're made in Galesburg, Illinois. They weigh 14 pounds. They're very, 9 pounds. They're very, very heavy. They heat them to 1600 degrees, and that's why they're so very, very heavy. And it's a certain kind of clay that they have over there near the city where they make the brick. So Iowa City was paved with those to begin with. Of course, now we use cement and asphalt, which are easier to put down and not as expensive. But the brick were very, very durable, and they, just like this street, is still in use, and it's been here for 90 years. Okay, we'll turn the corner. Now we're going to turn on Brown Street, and I never have been able to find out where Brown got its name. Nobody seems to know. At the next, boys and girls, at the next corner, there was the first hotel in Iowa City. And this hotel was 2 log cabins, and they built one of those dog trots in between. But it was a 2-story log cabin, and they had the saloon and the restaurant downstairs, and the people went up a ladder to sleep on the 2nd floor. And that was this house here is part of that original two log cabin setup. Right here, there's cypress wood in it. Nobody can figure out how they got cypress up here unless it came up the Mississippi from the south. But anyhow, there is cypress wood in this house. Originally, there were 2 railroads trying to get to Iowa City. One of them was the Lyons to Council Bluffs, and that railroad went right in back of this house. They graded it. They never actually were able to build the road. They ran out of money, and a lot of the Irishmen that were working for them were stranded in Iowa City, and so there were a lot of, that's one reason there were so many Irish to begin with. There were 4 ethnic groups in Iowa City. The Bohemians were the largest. They're up in the Goosetown area. There were a lot of Germans in there also. There were more Germans in Iowa than any other nationality, but in Iowa City it was primarily the Bohemian. The 3rd largest group were the Irish, and the 4th the Welsh, and they were mostly southwest of Iowa City around the Welsh Church. Okay, we'll move on. This house on the right was originally the Bohemel Shimmick house. It's on the National Historic Register. Bohemel Shimmick was one of the fine Bohemian residents. He was a professor in the university, very, very prominent. And this is the house that he built, and it's now on the National Register. Okay. Then in the middle of the next block, on the left-hand side, is a little stone house that was built in 1848. Stop in front of the house. It's on the left here. Right here. Right. Good. And this is the little house on the left. There were a number of houses like that built in Iowa City in the early years. This was in 1848, just 2 years after Iowa became a state. And the lady that owns it now, Mrs. Roger Anderson, came from Germany. And it reminded her so much of the houses in Germany that she said, well, I must own that house. So she owns it and rents it out. And they've restored it, and it's fixed up very, very fine. But it's a durable house, and it's seen so much of Iowa City developed from 1848. Okay, we'll move on. The little brick house on the left, or not house, the brick building, is the Prussian Music Hall. Originally it was CSPS Hall. The Bohemians built it way back in 1900 for $5,000, and they wanted it for a recreational, a social club, an athletic club, and they did had a lot of activities in here. The Bohemian people hung together pretty well, and so this is the house, or the building that they had 1905. I was up here last Sunday night to what they had, the Goosetown Gala, and all the people that knew about Goosetown were here, and they had some fine music, and then they wanted me to tell them all I knew about Goosetown. And see, the women used to herd the geese all through the east part of town here, and the geese would get all intermingled during the day, and you'd wonder how they ever got them separated. But when night came, every goose knew where home was. This empty space is where the Third Ward School used to be. That was there until Horace Mann was built in 1917. Horace Mann, Longfellow, and Sabin were all built in 1917. Now you're going to turn left here. Now this is St. Wenceslas Church, Catholic Church. The Bohemian people went to this church. They wanted to have their own church. They liked it at St. Mary's, but they wanted to have their own, and so they built this in 1893. They're going to have a 100th anniversary next year. Besides when they built this house, the man that owned the house next door here, Mr. Koza, gave the parsonage to the church, and so that's been the parsonage ever since. And this parsonage has 3 of those little windows. They call oculus windows, like an oculus for your eye. And so there are 3 of them in that house. It's a beautiful house. Look at the dormers on the top, how nice they are. Okay. Now Goosetown was the area all the way east from here to the city limits. And that's where they used to herd these gaggles of geese. Sometimes it was elderly women, sometimes boys and girls. Now boys and girls, this is sort of interesting. Way back in 1839, there was a lot of traffic between Iowa City and Dubuque. That was where the land office was located. And if somebody bought land, they needed to go up to Dubuque. So they were always getting lost. It was hilly and there were lots of trees. They were always getting lost, so they hired a man, Lyman Dillon, to plow a furrow all the way from Dubuque to Iowa City. And he did it with 8 yokes of oxen. Now you wonder, why did they use oxen instead of horses? Because oxen could be driven day after day after day without rest, whereas horses had to be rested. Well, anyhow, Mr. Dillon, Lyman Dillon, plowed that furrow, and we don't know exactly where in Goosetown it went, but we think it went down Dodge Street to Iowa Avenue, and then Iowa Avenue up to the old Capitol. So that was a pretty important event. Then the year after he plowed the furrow, they built a road from Dubuque to Iowa City because they were afraid that the Indians might get on the warpath with the whites. Maybe the whites were going onto their land, so they wanted to have a way for the troops to get down here from Dubuque. They called them the Dragoons. Fortunately, they were never needed. Poweshiek and his Indians were good Indians. They never caused any trouble, but they built that road 40 feet wide. The 20 feet in the center had the trees grubbed out. And of course, when it came to streams, they had to use ferries to get across. But that was pretty important, getting that furrow plowed. And they went all the way to Keosauqua, which is on the Missouri border with that national highway. Okay. So remember, Dillon's furrow. That's the longest furrow that was ever plowed, 100 miles. And this is the German, what was the German Lutheran Church. They call it the Zion Lutheran Church. The first church on this corner, the people built themselves. They went out and they chopped the trees down, made the brick, and they did a fine job with the church. You turn left here. We're crossing Market Street again. Market was one of the early streets to be paved, 1910. And why was Market Street paved early? Well, because it was an important street. There were 3 breweries on it. It carried the highway or the road to West Branch and to Rochester, so it was paved early. Iowa Avenue was paved in 1908. The College and Summit and Clinton were paved in 1897. The downtown was paved in 1897. And I told you how they put rock, asphalt in the downtown area in 1875 because it was a terrible mud hole in the spring. Also with the hogs in there, that made it still worse. And this, of course, is where Iowa City High School was. This is the high school that I went to. Also in this block was the grammar school, which is, they call it junior high now, but we called it grammar school, and we did get lots of grammar there too. I had a grammar teacher that was just outstanding. I sure learned a lot from her, and that was in this block. They also had the Second Ward School here, which was important. So this was called Center Market on the original plat, and they spelled center the English way, C-E-N-T-R-E, not T-E-R. Why they spelled it that way, nobody knows. It never was a market, though. It was always a school. Okay. Oh yes, we're on Johnson Street, and Johnson Street and Johnson County were named after Rumsey, Dumpsey, killed Tecumseh, Richard Mentor Johnson. He later became President of the United States, but Johnson Street was named after him. Now this house on our left, I call it the Eddie Green House. On your left, oh, this stone house. That was built in 1845 by a man who was going to the gold rush, and he built this for his family. And so this house, you see, is well, from 1845, almost 150 years old. And it was a stagecoach stop. People could stay there. They also loaded the stages. This whole block was the stagecoach block. They made the stagecoaches. My grandfather worked here. They shod the horses. 136 horses were stabled in this block or in adjacent blocks. So it was a busy place, and they ran stagecoaches in all directions from Iowa City. because that was the only way people could get around. There were no railroads yet. So they built those stagecoaches, and the first stage was out of here in 1840. And sometimes there were 2-horse stages, sometimes 4. But when the roads were muddy, they had a terrible time getting through. Sometimes I guess they just couldn't make it. And in snowdrifts they had problems. But it was the only transportation, and so they did use it. And it was a great, well, it provided work for lots of men who came to Iowa City. Okay, we'll turn. We turn right at the next corner, and we go up across a bridge over Ralston Creek. Now, Ralston Creek was named after Robert Ralston, who was one of the 3 men who located the site for Iowa City. Chauncey Swan, called the father of Iowa City, John Ronalds, and Robert Ralston. I always say that they named Ralston Creek after him because of that rampaging creek, because he was late to the meeting. But they used to have, this is Ralston Creek right here. Goes right through the center of Iowa City, and it always used to give lots of trouble with flooding, getting in people's basements, all kinds of difficulties. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. The house on our right on the hill was built by Mr. Downey. It's now the real house, a very fine mansion right up here to your right. When we get across the street, you can get a better look at it. You can see those beautiful bushes there. It's a lovely house. Well, now to come back to Ralston Creek, which is such a rampaging creek, every time a new city council came into office, they'd say, one of the things we're going to do is get Ralston Creek under control. And I remember in one of my newspaper articles, I said, well, if any city council ever gets Ralston Creek under control, I will eat crow. That's an expression that people use when they think something never can happen. So I said, if they ever get Ralston Creek under control, I'll eat crow. Well, I'll never say that again, because the Lions Club made me eat crow at the next meeting. And I did. It's not exactly my choice of entree. Now, this is College Green on our right. It was in the original plat of Iowa City. They're fixing it up now. It's been here ever since the first. You may have this in some of your books, but this is the original plat of Iowa City, 1 square mile. And so you might, it's in some of my books, I don't know which ones though, but you might look at it. This is in the University Historical Society, Palimpsest, February 1977. And it is really quite good. It explains where the streets got their names and how wide they were, and some other details. Well, now we're back on College Street, and College is one of the 3 prestigious residential streets, one of the fine residential streets. Clinton, College, and Summit. They were the fine homes, and this was one of the fine homes built in 1866. It's now the Louis Negus house, and it has very lovely Gothic lines. There used to be a wraparound porch on the house, but the Neguses have kept it up fine. 6 generations of the family have lived here, and they have some French furniture in it. It's really quite lovely. Then the house next door here, can you move up just a little? Was the original William Musser house. He was the big lumber baron in Iowa City. He had 9 lumber yards, and they had a big lumber mill down in Muscatine, and that's where they got a lot of the lumber. The Musser family lived here for many years. They would spend summers here. The spring and the fall here. They would go to Minnesota, to Walker Lake, where they had a cottage in the summer, and then they'd go to Arizona in the winter. And so this is the house that they lived in, built in 1893. Very fine house, and It had a coachman. Now would you move up just a little? Now stop right here when you get by this. A little further. A little further, please. Okay, boys and girls, this house, which is now where Professor Dixon lives, had a coachman's house in back. They kept the horses back there, and the coachman lived upstairs. And you see, they still have the brick driveway in to the house. So it was a very, very fine house in early Iowa City. Okay. The next house we're going to see is the Carson House. And this, boys and girls, is one of the fine houses of Iowa City. It's on the corner. It's the Alpha Phi sorority house now, on the northeast corner of College and Governor Street. Now this is the Carson House. It was built in 1875 for $8,000. That's the money the Carsons made in selling clover seed the previous year. And their place was up there where that new College of Business Administration building is. That's where their first store was, where they sold farm machinery and seed. And so this is a house that they built back in '75. It's a lovely place. They had laboratories in every bedroom. They had 2 furnaces in the house. It has been a wonderful place, and the sorority has kept it up well. It's an expensive house to keep up. It cost $25,000 to paint it in the last couple of years. So it is a fine place, and one of the show places, I think, of Iowa City, and yet it's almost 125 years old. So take a look at it whenever you go by, because it is a lovely place. This house on the corner here is a Lindsay house. It's a mail order on the right here. Just turn the corner and move stuff. It was a mail order house. Came from down in Tennessee, from eastern Tennessee. They shipped everything up here, all the windows, all the woodwork. It was very ornate, and you couldn't buy this kind of lumber in 1890 in Iowa City. So they shipped it up, and there are 175 houses like this in the United States. And there's one out in Oregon where there are 50,000 people go through it every year because they have a lot of antiques in it. But the house is now owned by the Lances, and they use it for student housing. Okay. And this apartment house on the left here are the Summit Apartments. That was built before there were zoning ordinances in Iowa City, and the people in the neighborhood never would have stood for the apartment house to be built, but they had no way of stopping it. So this is the Summit Apartments and the Burlington Apartments. They're nice apartments, but the people who lived here didn't like the idea. Okay, keep going there. We're on Summit Street now, and the reason it's called Summit is because it is the summit of that original Iowa City. It's the highest point. This corner is 728 feet above sea level. And the Iowa River at the Burlington Street Bridge that we crossed is 639 feet above sea level. The second step on the west approach to Old Capitol is 698 and 4/10 feet above sea level. So that can show you how Iowa City goes up and down. Stop. See this post on the right? That was the cornerstone for the Iowa City southeast corner when they laid out the city in 1839. So they put that stone there. That marks the southeast corner. Okay. Now we're out of the original square mile for about a block. Then we're going to turn right and we're heading for home. These are all very fine homes on Summit Street. This was a very outstanding, prestigious residential area. Still is. This area to the south during the Civil War was Camp Pope. It was a Civil War camp. There's a stone at Longfellow School showing that was Camp Pope. They trained a lot of Army troops here, and then they sent them away on the Rock Island Railroad. Okay, we want to stop in front of this. Yeah, this yellow house on the left is it's where the Swishers live today, and it was built way back in the 70s, one of the very fine Gothic type houses in Iowa City, and you can see they've kept it up nicely, and it's on a half a block of ground here. The interior is very unusual, so it is quite an outstanding house, and keep it in mind is one of the 3 outstanding Gothic style houses in Iowa City. Okay, boys and girls, these 2 houses that you see here, 510 and 520, just keep going, are what are called sister houses. They are the identical plans, except they are in reverse. My grandfather built the one to the south, and my aunt and uncle built the one to the north. And that way they lived close together. They had a wide yard in between them and a well, and those were called sister houses. I don't know why the name, but that's what they were called. One thing I do want to tell you that we would have talked about if we'd been able to go on down is the Rock Island Railroad. That got to Iowa City New Year's Eve, 1855, and that was the most important thing that ever happened in Iowa City. They were to get a prize of $50,000 if they got to Iowa City before midnight in 1855. They were still a quarter of a mile from the depot at 9 o'clock. All the citizens of Iowa City that were able went down to the tracks. They built fires because it was a cold night, and they helped lay the ties. They helped lay the rails, and so just before midnight, the last rail was in place, and a train pulled up to the depot, and so they got the $50,000.